Herzlich willkommen zu Alte Geschichte im Dialog. Mein Gast heute ist Christopher Tuplin. Hello, Christopher.
Hello, very glad to be here, Michael.
Christopher Tuplin is the Gladstone Professor of Greek History at the University of Liverpool. And since you know that I've been at the University of Liverpool for 7 years, Christopher, we've been colleagues for those 7 years, and it's been a very, very nice time. So I enjoyed that very much. And I'm very glad to have you here today for an interview on the Persian side of the Persian Wars. Christopher Tuplin has published widely on Achaemenid history. So he is the specialist for the Persian side. And my first question would be, since we've got so much material from the Greek side, we've got, of course, Herodotus, we've got Plutarch, we've got Thucydides, we've got the odd inscription. So we know quite a bit about the Greek point of view. Isn't there anything we know about the Persian side of things?
Well, it depends, as so often, what exactly you mean and when you're talking about. From a strictly Persian side of things, one might have to say, well, we have Persian royal inscriptions, so we have ideological statements by Persian kings written in a Persian language as well as in other languages. That is, in one sense, the closest we get to Persian view of anything, and it has some distant relevance to the Persian Wars, which is, I guess, meant to be a focus here. We have huge amounts of documentary material from the heartland, from the heart of the empire, from Persepolis, written in Elamite, not in Persian, and relating to broadly to economic activities, the incomings and outgoings of natural produce and labor in an area about the size of Switzerland surrounding Persepolis. That is genuinely Persian material and extraordinarily valuable evidence about what it is evidence about. It is not, or only tangentially, but slightly connectable, for example, with the Persian Wars or with the more general relationship of Greece and Persia over time. There is a huge amount of material from Achaemenid Babylonia, vast numbers of cuneiform tablets, unevenly distributed across the period of the empire, and again, and not representing any of it what might be described as official Achaemenid imperial archives. It entirely comes from either private or temple environments, and so is at best an indirect evidence about Persian imperial behavior in Babylonia, though it is primary evidence, of course, about the economy and society of Babylonia in, as it happens, the Achaemenid period. So we know an awful lot about that, but its intersection with, I suppose, Greco-Persian political military history is, again, very scant, though not absolutely zero. Much smaller amounts of material from Egypt, much smaller amounts of material, again, written material from other places too. Certain amount of, most notably Aramaic language documents from Egypt, some of which do come from actually the heart of the Achaemenid administrations, and so much closer. We get close to the satrap Ashama in Egypt in a way you don't quite get close to his equivalents in Babylonia or wherever else. Great amount of archaeologically pertinent archaeological material and art historical material, both from the heart of the empire and particularly from the western end of it, and so on and so on. There is a great deal of stuff that comes out of an entirely non-Greek environment, both culturally and linguistically, that sits within the period of the Achaemenid Empire, and therefore is capable of casting light on certain aspects of that imperial system in relation to certain places. You can have huge amounts of material, however, I mean, vast amounts of material that do not directly intersect with the imperial system. And that in itself is, of course, quite interesting. I mean, what goes on in Babylonia or in southern Palestine, where the huge numbers of Ostraka from Idumea have almost no visible connection with the Achaemenid system, but they attest an extraordinarily complicated and highly recorded system of moving commodities around in a relatively small part of southern Palestine. It betokens an extremely organized agricultural system and bureaucratized agricultural system that does not ostensibly have anything to do with the Achaemenid system. I mean, in which you do not see Achaemenid officials at all, and it is a matter of debate what the status of these documents is, what they're doing in their own terms, and whether it has any connection at all with the existence of an imperial power. So these things are tantalizing, if you like. But I mean, the imprint of the empire is visible wherever you have any sources at all, but the visibility of that imprint can be really quite slight, considering the size, longevity, and its historical importance of the system. And this is an abiding issue with Achaemenid history. But actually proving there was an Achaemenid empire, if you had no Greek sources to tell you there was, would be possible, but but it would be an interesting exercise.
But it's you mentioned it. There is a wealth of actually relevant material if you want to write a narrative of the Persian wars. And I have to plead guilty now, because I'm an ancient historian, of course, with my Latin and Greek. And so my seminar on the Persian wars is also, it has Herodotus very much in the focus, whereas this Persian material, you mentioned sources from Egypt, which are in Aramaic, you mention Elamite sources, so you need to know an awful lot of languages in order to access these sources. So what do scholars in order to...
Or you need to be prepared, quite boldly to say, well, nobody can know all of these, so we just have to do the best we can. I mean, this is to those brought up in the traditional mode of the study of Greek and Latin antiquity, which puts a high premium on good functional grasp of those languages and their literatures, it is sobering to try and deal with the ancient Near East in relation to that Greco-Roman world and be compelled largely to rely upon Assyriologists, Egyptologists, Semiticists to recover the text, to interpret them correctly, to explain them to you, to tell you what they are saying. That is not what the traditional Greek and Roman historian likes to do, but you have to buy into that. The thing is, the Persian Wars in particular, the source base we have from non-Greek sources is remarkably unhelpful, specifically about the Persian Wars, if by that one means 490, 480, 479, or indeed in general about political military conflict between the Persians and the extreme Western frontier. Mm-hmm. What non-Greek source material can do for you is illuminate the systems by which the Persian imperial machinery operated. And that can cast a little bit of light. So, I mean, you read that little bit in Herodotus about how they dug the canal through the neck of the Athos Peninsula, and about dividing up the work groups to do it on ethnic grounds, and about setting up an infrastructure that would supply the food to the people who are going to do it. What is under the surface there, behind the surface there, is what is illuminated by the Persepolis fortification tablets, and indeed any number of of other type documents of a similar sort from other parts of the empire. That is the sense that there is a bureaucratic system that can manage and control both people and produce, and carry out an enterprise like digging a canal through the Athos Peninsula. That's a point at which what you read in Herodotus does distantly intersect with actually a very large body of material, none of which, however, has any direct relationship whatsoever to what was happening in the North Aegean just before 480 BC. The finding specific links is with that particular set of events is, well, frankly, impossible. You would never guess that there had been an invasion of Greece from any non-Greek source material.
Yes. So this
is at our disposal.
This is quite a curious finding, because I mean, from our point of view, the Persian Wars seem of such paramount historical importance. Think of John Stuart Mill, who said that the Battle of Marathon, even for English history, was more important than the Battle of Hastings, all this kind of stuff. And then you go into the Persian documents and you find nothing or next to nothing. Was Greece simply underneath the radar from a Persian point of view? Were there other more important hotspots?
Oh, I mean, the issue is simply the type of documentary archive that is at our disposal does not intersect with what's happening in the western end of the empire. And of course, I mean, let us be clear, this is one of these, it's kind of so obvious to the Persian historian, we often forget to say it. There is no narrative of historical events from a Persian perspective at all, apart from the narrative of Dareios' accession, which does, of course, intersect in certain ways with the narrative in Herodotus. Otherwise, after that text had been written, no one ever again wrote an even propagandistic account of political military events, specific ones, from the point of view of the Persian king. At best, there are entirely anonymized references to generic types of events, but even that is quite rare. So we don't have a story, we don't have a competing storyline at all about any part of the empire, never mind about the extreme west. And I mean, that is the fundamental reason why the story of the Persian Wars, or the story of Greek-Persian conflict, is a story of which the Greeks have, primary control. And we can illuminate aspects of it by a better understanding of how the Persian system worked as a bureaucratic and system. We may occasionally be able to deploy such information to cast doubt upon particular propositions in Greek sources, though it's not often possible to do that. But we cannot deploy an alternative narrative. We can, to the extent that we cannot actually say on evidential grounds that from the Persian point of view, what happened in the far west was, or indeed in the far east, was of minor importance. They don't tell us what at all. The only thing we do have, which I do actually, well, which has a certain pertinence here, is not literary, not textual at all, but a category of sealstone design, which shows military combat between individual figures, normally only two, never more than 3 or 4. I mean, this is a category which occurs in various styles across a great portion of the history of the empire, with artifacts that come from a number of different provenances and from no known provenance. And what is striking about this category is that the combats that are shown are between Persian figures and almost exclusively either what for convenience one might call Scythians, nomadic peoples, probably Central Asiatic ones primarily, or Greeks. The only other category that comes in a little bit is Egyptians. So you could say, well, here is a category of icon, if you like, represented to us in a number of examples, all of them in Kleinkunst. This is never on the walls of Persepolis, though it is found on tombstones and things in Anatolia, which constructs military actual fighting between recognizably Persian and Greek figures as of significant symbolic importance, I suppose, in the same degree that such conflict with nomadic peoples from the other end of the empire is of symbolic significance. Now, I mean, this relating any such individual artifacts or any particular events is probably a mug's game. I mean, some of them are on Babylonian tablets are actually very closely datable, or at least have a terminus ante for their creation. But I think that's not the issue. The issue is that there is an ideological discourse which you wouldn't guess from the walls of Persepolis or Susa, which is concerned to assert Persian military superiority over people at the extremities of the empire. So the Far West, if there were a narrative of Persian history from the Persian point of view, one would on that ground expect that it would actually give some considerable weight to what happened on the Greek frontier, just because it is the furthest frontier in the West. But we would also, which would be wonderful, have a narrative about similar conflict on the eastern frontier, about which nobody tells us anything, of course. Greeks knew nothing about it, and, well, no one else there to tell us. Egypt is the interesting tertium quid here. Egypt does not figure very often in this iconography, but it does figure in some quite famous items too. I mean, the Dareios seal from, there are Alte Geschichte seals from Egypt, which are really quite prominent images here. But on the evidence available, I mean, in terms of the artifacts surviving, it's actually has less impact than the extreme west and the extreme east. So, I mean, there is a sort of evidence there that tells us if the Persians had ever written historical narratives, we might well actually have had a narrative about the West that could be run alongside the Greek ones. I think it would have been a very different character, but who knows? I mean, this is a this is a thought experiment that, well, you can only go so far with. But so I think one does hear it sometimes said that Greek historians have to realize that the Persians really weren't terribly interested in Greece. It was an awful long way away and very minor. I think that is quite wrong, both on those grounds and both in other grounds too. I mean, I do not think the Persian king was uninterested in what was going on in any parts of his imperial space. And the imperial space in the extreme west at times included Greeks, in times notably didn't, and certainly produced a good deal of conflict. Some of it, quite a lot of it after a certain point, is kind of localized, but I don't think he was likely to be uninterested in it. And actually a recent book by John Hyland, it really pushes against the view David Lewis expressed sort of 40 years ago more, that it was really very hard for the king to have much of a handle on what was going on in the Far West because because of communication difficulties. Hyland has been very impressed, I think rightly, by one thing that comes out of the Persepolis archive, which is that there was a system of relatively high-speed communication, and you can actually reasonably postulate that information and instructions could pass back and forth between, as it might be, Tissaphernes and Dareios II on a sufficiently rapid basis for it to be perfectly plausible that the king took an active interest in what was going on, rather than just receiving reports months after the event of what had happened.
So meaning, how much time would have lapsed for information to travel from, say,
information could go back and forth in 2 to 3 weeks easily.
It's not very much considering the distances.
It's not much. I mean, by the standards of the time. I mean, Hyland has been able to demonstrate that, well, to make very plausible that there are a number of texts from 494 BC from Persepolis which seem to relate. All they record is ration provisions for rapid travellers, but you can make a quite plausible case that these are people going back and forth between Artaphernes and Sardis and Dareios in Susa or Persepolis, and also between Dareios and other Western satraps at the same time, to which, you know, the explanation of which, obviously it's tempting to say, is that they are exchanging information at the time of, towards the end of the Ionian Revolt. But this is just accidental noise in the ration system that reflects the existence of politically important message passing in relation to an event that we do know about. And that's a very rare possibility because the archive is there and it's still operating at that date. A year and a bit later, that archive is dead. So it contains nothing to tell us about 490. If it was running, I mean, if that archive ran right through past 490, you could reasonably expect that there would be a similar sort of indirect evidence that something big was going on in the West. I mean, the notion that the extremities of the empire are not interesting to the center is I think, very misleading and needs to be suppressed. But that doesn't mean we can tell any stories.
No,
the only stories are told by Greeks.
But as you said, so the Persian sources have more in store for those who are interested basically in structural history than in the histoire événementielle. And so what we can actually access information on is the modus operandi of the Persian Empire. So could we say from the evidence at hand how hypothetically speaking, how the Persians would have administered Greece? Would annexation have been successful?
Well, that's two different. Whether it would have been successful is, I suppose, in the end, a political question, isn't it? How they would have tried to administer it, one can, at least in broad terms, judge from our impression of the bureaucracy of the empire. I mean, this is an imperial system that is highly dependent on bureaucratic procedures, on writing, on everything being accounted for. We see that most clearly in Persepolis because we have the largest number of tablets from there that actually belong to the imperial system. We see it faintly in Babylonia because the actions of the system impinge upon private and institutional Babylonian entities, but you never see it directly. You discern, one thing you do discern, I think, is that you can't necessarily predict in detail what for example, the fiscal structures imposed on a conquered territory would be, because they are likely to be significantly affected by what the fiscal structures already in place were like. So the aim of the Persian system is to extract surplus as tribute and in other forms too, really. I mean, it's not only about actual surplus extracted and removed from the periphery to the center. It's about managing the economic system of a particular area in a fashion that generates a locally consumable surplus that funds itself, so to speak. And how that is done in detail depends on how it was done beforehand, to some extent. So how it would have worked in, I don't know, in Persian Athens or Persian Sparta is a nice question, especially the latter. And it would not necessarily worked in exactly the same way even in those two places, even if they fell in some sense within what you might call the same satrapy. So I mean, diversity of precise means is a thing that does tend to emerge from the evidence, but the intention to control to the extent of shall we say, keeping the peace and making a profit is fairly clear. How many native Persians you need in a given place to achieve that is quite an interesting question. Not perhaps as many as you might imagine, but that will vary from place to place. I mean, I've always suspected there may have been more native Persians in Western Anatolia than there were in Egypt, for example, but I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to say. Or than even in Babylonia. I mean, a lot of the Persians who took benefit from these places were not necessarily resident in them. And the number of Persian names surviving in Babylonian documents for the whole empire is well under 1,000. I mean, it's really not very big considering the huge number of Babylonian names that survive. So, I mean, this is the thing, it's rather hard to judge. And what the case in Greece would have been, who knows? Central and southern Greece is kind of geopolitically a different ballgame, really, from anywhere else the empire actually controlled. I mean, small city-state, so it's a bit like Phoenicia, but the geography of Phoenicia is not the geography of central and southern Greece, or even the geography of northern Greece, which the empire did control for a while.
The distances are different.
But also the compartmentalization, you know, the balkanization, for want of a better word. Yes. Whether that would have told in favor, whether that would have helped or hindered Persian control is a nice question. I mean, one way in which imperial systems like this do indeed benefit is the famous, you know, is the divide and rule. And you've got to say central and southern Greece divided itself so energetically that a foreign conqueror with sufficient resource to get to first base at all, in a sense, might be said to have had things going for him. I mean, the very problems that in the Herodotean narrative, you know, beset the resistance to the Persian attack, if the Persian attack had been successful, would have been, you might argue, beneficial from the new ruler's point of view. I mean, dividing Athenians against Corinthians, against Megarians, against Spartans, against Arcadians, well, they did it for you. So, and to an extent, this was, of course, true, I guess, for the Greeks of Western Anatolia and the north. It's a different ball game from controlling Egypt, and probably from controlling Babylonia. Though Babylonia too is a place of distinct identities, you know, between different cities. And one of the things it's really, yes, I've quite thought of it in these terms before, but I'm not sure that the nature of evidence we have about Babylonia really allows you to make much of a conjecture about how far the Persians were actually playing Babylon off against Nippur, against Sippar, against Uruk. I don't think you can really see that, though it's certainly true that the fiscal arrangements in different places could be different, but that's probably because it's just convenient to take money from people the way they want you to take it from them, if you see what I mean. Well, you know, the tax systems won't be quite the same, but that doesn't tell you a lot about whether there's a political tension being played with. I don't know. But Greece would have been a goal-zone spot for that.
This raises the question, of course, what were the resources the Persians were after in Greece? I mean, by comparison with Egypt, Babylonia, Greece wasn't awfully rich, and there wasn't that much
No.
to be got from.
Well,
Greece.
I mean, in all parts of the empire, in a sense, the default resource is natural produce, and I mean, Athens, of course, you have silver mines. That would have been a matter of particular interest, as perhaps had been the silver of the northern Aegean, no doubt, during the period the Persians controlled that. Though, but for the rest of a lot of the rest of Greece, yes, I mean, this is not a place that produces huge surpluses. Whereas much of the rest of the empire, I suppose, counts as doing so, though Egypt and Babylonia stand out exceptionally. But they would have been interested in extracting from that surplus either surplus in kind, which would have literally fed the ration system, supporting, well, the native Persians present as part of the ethnoclass dominant, but also the other people who were serving the system, whoever they might have been, I mean, including Greeks, no doubt. So once you import a number of people who are going to who both express the existence of the imperial system and actually cause it to function, and they need to be paid for, to put it crudely, and they are paid for in one fashion by making sure that the system produces an agricultural surplus that will feed them. Beyond that, you may or may not, yourself, or you allow your subjects to monetize some of this produce, and then you take some of that off them too. The special case of yes, Persians controlling Attica with their own silver mine, but of course in this scenario they would also still have had access to the silver mines in the northern Aegean too, and that is something they did not, of course, get from Egypt, say. Mm-hmm. All the silver flowed anyway. I mean, one of the strange things is that the silver flowed from the west to the east, irrespective of where the border of the empire was in the long term.
Yes.
And, well, if the empire's borders had in fact included Greece, whether the net effect would have been different or greater, different in quality or greater in quantity, I don't know. It might have started quicker. I mean, the big flow of silver eastwards, perhaps, but it began with when the Persians arrived in northern Aegean. Really, it was already beginning then. Silver was going south. Attic silver didn't flow in huge amounts until quite some time after the Persian Wars. Maybe that would have been different. It would have started earlier, but in a way, the Persians won on that. Insofar whether that mattered to them in that form is nice. Into all sorts of questions about thesaurization and too much silver sitting in Susa doing nothing and so on, which perhaps we haven't got the time to go into now. But which is is an ongoing matter of debate again. Actually, the Persians were not so impressed by the coining of silver ever to think of doing it themselves outside areas where it wasn't done anyway, so the West. But they certainly liked silver. I mean, everyone likes silver. It's a convenient and portable expression of value, which, when push comes to shove, you can expend for goods and services, e.g. mercenaries. But in first instance, they were looking to have a reasonably peaceful political military situation from which those whose job it was to supervise that could take a profit, and some elements of the dominant ethno-class who may not ever even gone to Greece might have been able to take, as it were, some personal surplus out of landed estates that were given over to them. Now, the benefit of much of Greece from a Persian aristocrat's point of view in those terms would have been relatively small, I guess, compared with other parts of the empire. So it would not have, it wouldn't really have shifted. Well, his impression is that, that at least from the centre of the empire westwards, probably the huge proportion in value terms of the profit made by Persian aristocrats from landed estates in conquered territories came from Egypt and Babylonia. I would guess everywhere else must have come a bit second, and southern mainland Greece would not have been particularly profitable.
Yeah. No, agriculture there, of course, was hugely more productive, and
and so it's a different ballgame. But of course, I mean, it's not only an economic issue. I mean, the king distributes land to favoured people in conquered territories, not just on the basis, well, you get a lot of bucks out of that, but of course it's an expression of his beneficence to his loyal servants. So, I mean, landed estates would have been given because they had to be given as part of the way the system worked, but they would not have been, in fact, financially so valuable. Whether that mattered, I don't know how much that mattered to the individual Persian aristocrat, particularly ones not of the highest level. I mean, the balance between the amount of material benefit you will get from it, and the sense of status you acquired from the fact that you possess such estates, is a nice question. And you could even say, well, there might have been particular kudos to have had an estate, I don't know, in the plain of Sparta, say, as you sat at your dinner parties in Susa and discussed with your friends, how their property portfolio was going. Maybe an estate in Sparta would have a certain cachet, even if it wasn't especially profitable. Who knows? I mean, very hard to get much insight into that sort of aspect of the frame of mind of these people. I mean, you can read Achaemenid's letters and about Egypt, and you see very clearly that he wants all the profit that is due from his land that he can possibly get. That we see clearly, and I'm sure that was true of a lot of people. I mean, if you've got a bit of land, you don't want it to be less profitable than it could be.
Yes.
But that's not quite the question. The question is how much it matters to you that you've got the land at all as a matter of kudos and status, alongside the fact that it makes money and you don't want it to underperform. And they're two different things, and we can see the latter very clearly, but the former is, I mean, that's elusive. We don't have that sort of way into their mentality. Don't have the right sort of literature, really.
Well, and it's a hypothetical question anyway. Well, we get back to the long-term consequences of the wars in Greece in a minute. But before that, I'm curious, did the fact that the campaigns in Greece were unsuccessful, did that have any repercussions on the Persian Empire itself? I mean, we see that a couple of years after Marathon, there's the revolt in Egypt. Is that in any way possibly connected?
I think the revolt in Egypt, it's as likely to do with the fact that the old king died, mm-hmm. as it is that his army was defeated at Marathon. And of course there was a revolt in Babylonia shortly afterwards as well, which had huge repercussions there. I mean, the 480s were a bad time for revolts in the really valuable parts of the empire, but though I am all in favour of not giving too much to those who accuse us all of Hellenocentrism, I think to account for those phenomena in terms of Marathon would be unreasonably Helleноcentric. Maybe you could say the combination of the failure of a military enterprise and the illness and death of the king, and that's not only any old king, of course. This is Darius. I mean, Darius is a figure of extraordinary status in the formation and preservation of the empire. the start of effectively a new dynasty, that the refounder of the empire, his demise was always going to be an extraordinary watershed moment. That he was succeeded not by his eldest son, actually by a very young king, that he had died at a great age, and the cumulative impact upon Egypt and Babylonia of 2 generations of Persian rule. I think that there is a sort of, there's an accident there waiting to happen, and I think it's an amalgamation of those things. I mean, one of the sort of big stories that people have extracted from Babylonian material over the last 20, 30 years is an ever-increasing sense of the probable burden, of the fiscal burden on Babylonia by virtue of its being part of the empire. As I said, you only see the phenomena of this very fleetingly and indirectly in documents that are not directly concerned with it. But the growing sense is that the tax burden on the traditional Babylonian sort of upper class, if you like, was growing over particular Dareios' reign, and that more and more invention was being put into finding things you could tax, if you like. I mean, in other words, that the fiscal system was getting more complicated. And I think it is probably plausible that and a similar thing will certainly have been true in Egypt, though we can't see so clearly there. I think that sense conjoined with the sense of a long reign coming to an end, and perhaps some people knowing that there'd been a bit of an embarrassment militarily in Greece. These are what I think generate the upsets of the 480s. The astonishing thing, though, is the efficiency with which that upset is repressed. I mean, Xerxes deals with Egypt, Herodotus says, made it more enslaved than it was before. I mean, God, I wish we knew what that meant, if indeed it means anything. In Babylon, of course, we hear nothing at all about that really from Greek sources, only very scantily, but it becomes very clear that the consequences in Babylon of what was a very rapid suppression of 2 different pretenders were extreme in terms of, if you like, the social and economic demography of the country. A whole existing traditional elite class was kind of sidelined and replaced by a new one. And this really, well, overnight is a bit strong, but in short order. So that, by the time you get to 480, on the face of it, there is really no reason why Xerxes should not be mounting a military campaign at the west of the empire, because he has shown actually remarkable efficiency in putting a lid on what might have been, in theory, a real threat to the empire. So yes, I'm not quite sure how we got into this thread of conversation, but yeah, you were asking about longer term sort of impact and so on. I mean, there is a long-term impact of the Persian failure in Greece, I think, which is that there's no clear sign of them ever attempting anything of a similar sort again. I mean, after Xerxes, we are really looking at a kind of steady state empire, which is perfectly prepared to deploy its resources to suppress rebellions within its borders, and which, as John Hyland has argued in his recent book, I mean, is interested in exploring the possibilities, if you like, of of the western frontier at the Aegean, and interfering and not letting anyone forget that the empire exists and the king is powerful, and that, who knows, it might even be quite nice to cozy up to him. But falling short really of any suggestion of an actual attempt, at redoing Xerxes better, so to speak.
So a little bit like the
which touches on, sorry?
A little bit like the Hadrianic Roman Empire, which
yes, I mean, I think that is how one should see it, but the point is, one should see it that as a positive choice, and actually a not unsuccessful one. I mean, the empire lasted just fine after the Greeks had, to their great self-congratulation, given it such a bloody nose. I mean, when you read that stuff in Aeschylus' Persians about the Persians left in Susa bewailing what has happened and imagining how the Persian system is going to collapse and it's the end of everything, and well, of course it wasn't, nor indeed did Aeschylus didn't think it was, and the audience in Athens in 472 didn't really think it was, but they didn't know exactly how it was going to go, and they were in quite a gung-ho mode at the time, so who knows? But as a matter of fact, it didn't at all. The empire, so to speak, retreated at most to a boundary a little bit into Western Asia Minor, and was fine. And then actually a century later, it recovered that. Artaxerxes did win back the immediate the Anatolian territorial consequences of Xerxes' defeat. And that's fine. That was all I think he or Darius II had wanted. I think they wanted that. And they worked towards it, you might say, rather inefficiently in some ways, for quite a long period of time. But they didn't. They worked towards it as a goal on which they quite like to get to without spending more on it than they absolutely had to. I mean, that's the burden of John Hyland's recent book, that a really governing principle there are two governing principles for a Persian king. One is that there is an ideological claim to world domination, and there's certainly an ideological claim to displaying one's capacity to influence things, but there is also a really brute bottom line that you don't want to spend too much money on doing so. So you try to get the biggest result for the least resource. And Greeks did observe that. And I think you have to say that the events from about 412 to the King's Peace do tend to exemplify this, that you yes. feel that if you'd be prepared to spend money hand over foot, then he could have recovered Asia Minor much more rapidly and less messily. But anyway, but I don't think there was no notion that they were going to start, despite what it said in one of the treaty drafts in 412-11, they weren't actually going to. The king was not laying claim to all the territory that his forebears had ever controlled, which yes. means the whole of Balkan Greece down to the Megarian frontier. They weren't actually after that. So they readjusted the notion of what might count as an adequate performance of the king's ideological responsibilities. And meanwhile, they just went on enjoying themselves, eating and drinking, and enjoying the fruits of imperial control, and facing rebellions here and there, and notably in Egypt. I mean, Egypt was a real embarrassment for the empire for a long time, but even there, they eventually briefly won.
Yes.
After 60 years.
Couldn't it actually be that the Persians have, in the long term, achieved surprisingly much of their original agenda? I mean, what they got in the West was a period of unprecedented peace, and quite docile Greeks. You mentioned the divide et impera thing, and the Greeks did all the divide part by themselves. So
they certainly didn't. Yeah, I think the empire was. I mean, the empire was very successful. and I think it successfully made the transition from a conquest era to a steady state era, and this it's partly the wisdom of Artaxerxes the First, maybe. I think it helped that the initial conquest era was very brief and very intense, and much of Darius' reign actually is on a sort of border between conquest era and steady state. And Darius is after the beginning of his reign. He is, of course, from the point of view of Greek observers, associated basically with failed conquest. The Scythian expedition and Marathon. It's not entirely true, because he had, after all, taken possession of northern Greece and Macedonia. So, the Scythian expedition was actually a success if you reckon perhaps properly on what would count for a success of that venture. But that was well in the past by the end of Darius' reign. The Marathon enterprise and then Xerxes picking up of it have, I think, to be countered as attempts at conquest. These were attempts to extend the practical frontier. The Greek perspective is that it was all the Greeks' fault for rebelling in Asia Minor. There is a story there that's saying, well, if the Ionian Revolt had not happened, was there a powerful impetus for Darius to go back on the warpath in the West? He'd secured the north and Macedonia and a decent modus vivendi, I think, with Thessaly. Was there a strong reason why he would do any more than that unless somebody gave him a reason? This is where issues like the relative poverty of central and southern Greece come in. Judged in terms of balance sheet terms, as is this a place where we could grab a lot of really nice land, and a lot of of our friends and relatives can add to their portfolios in a really profitable fashion. Anyone who really knew their stuff about this would have had to say, well, on the whole, not really. There isn't a lot of point in that. So long as they cause us no trouble, perhaps there's no point in us causing them any trouble, because it will cause us more trouble not to get a big profit. But they did cause us trouble. Once they caused trouble, that's another matter. Although it is the Herodotean story, it isn't necessarily false that the Ionian Revolt was the beginning of many evils for Greeks and Persians. That without it, it's a question how things might have gone. And we might already have been we'd been in a steady state since the middle of the penultimate decade of the 6th century, and Darius was more interested in building palaces than in conquering worlds, as far as one can see. We don't know about the East, people always tell us, but India had already been got by then. Maybe the steady state would have been kicking in already before the turn of the century, and could have gone on in perpetuity but there is always the problem of having a bunch of Greeks who are not your subjects and a bunch who are, was always potentially a weakness, because they undoubtedly interacted with one another one way or the other, and you didn't really want them not to, because it probably produced economic activity which helped, from which you got a spin-off. So it was maybe an accident waiting to happen. And the Ionian Revolt came, that was the form it came in, but it might have come in another one. Once that had happened, I think, the ideological imperatives Persian king is under, as you reading his own ideological statements. If somebody creates disorder in the western part of your empire, if in the language of Behistun, the lie, becomes rampant, then it is incumbent upon the king to do something about it. That's what he is for. And
so he didn't really have much choice.
Not. And I mean, okay, he could just repress the rebels in Asia Minor and call that a day. I mean, maybe that could have been squared ideologically, but you can see that that's a tricky one. That unless you repress the tellers of lies who were the other side of the Aegean, then the problem wasn't really repressed.
Wouldn't Athens have interfered in the Ionian revolt? Then that would have been a more viable option, probably, for.
Well, yes. I mean, if the Greeks of the mainland had all taken the Spartan view,
yes,
and told Aristagoras to go away and stop bothering them, then, and nothing had happened, then you are where you are, and there is no strong reason why the Persian king should upset that modus vivendi. Once the Athenians and Eretrians, in very half-hearted fashion, have, then it's unraveling. And although the king might have been able to argue that simply by suppressing the rebellion within his own borders, he had restored order, suppressed the lie, done everything that the king was supposed to, it's certainly understandable that there might have been people who tried to persuade him that wasn't the case, possibly for self-interested reasons. I mean, Mardonius talking to Xerxes, we see at length. I mean, the equivalent of people talking to Darius before 490, we don't. There we just have Darius talking to himself about it, and his servant reminding him of the Athenians. But in truth, there must have been other people talking to Darius about what should be done about this, not least his brother in Sardis, you would have thought. So he was in a trickier position then and the temptation perhaps to think, okay, we'd better, these people who have interfered and caused trouble and burnt, the temple of Cybele in Sardis, I mean, which I think really got up their noses, actually. I mean, this was a really prestigious religious institution of their subjects, the Lydians, and I think it mattered. It mattered to the king that had been destroyed, even though it was not his god. It was the goddess of his subjects.
He's responsible. And
it was a very high-profile victim. But on the other hand, you could say, well, these people who did these Athenians and Eretrians, there weren't very many of them, and then they went off home, and they're clearly a bit feeble, really. It's probably quite easy to suppress the problem at source. And I mean, and so the temptation to think, well, if I'm going to restore order and do what I should as a good ideologically motivated king, I should go that extra mile and do it properly.
Yes.
Would be quite strong. And there may well have. I think there must have been a calculation that this would be relatively easy. I mean, they made a miscalculation there.
Quite a massive one.
And we do know that that Hippias was telling them that it would be not only desirable but also easy, and that he could help make it easy. What we don't hear is we hear about him talking to Darius, or as it were indirectly. We don't hear about the high Persian aristocracy talking to him, but they may well have all been singing from the same song sheet, and have thought this was actually both money and kudos relatively easily won. And of course, it has to be said, when that proved not to be the case, the problem in those terms goes nuclear. And then Darius dies. I mean, wretched Xerxes has no choice. I mean, all that stuff at the beginning of Book 7 Herodotus is a wonderful literary sort of putting on stage almost of a real political truth that in the circumstances he faced, it was really hard to ignore the embarrassment of Marathon.
Yes.
And of course, he had just, as I said, successfully suppressed 2 major rebellions in much more important places, and must have been on an absolute high of certainty that he could manage this.
And yet, after Xerxes, it becomes possible to abandon the project of conquering Greece militarily. Maybe to conclude, so the relationship between Persia and Greece, or the Greek polis, becomes a diplomatic one, and Persia never again interferes militarily in Greek matters, but diplomatically, okay,
and militarily. I mean, diplomacy only. I mean, the diplomacy always needs a lever, and the lever is military. I mean, if we're fast forwarding to the last decade of the 1st century, and the extended Peloponnesian War that actually ends with the King's Peace. I mean, that is the whole point of that period, is that there is a mixture of diplomacy and, as I said, cost-averse military action. And in the end, it is the creation of a situation by military action that actually drives the solution. I mean, the King's Peace, among other things, can only happen because the Athenians have been put in a position, in a weakened military position by the effective alliance between Sparta and Persia. You always need the military lever, but Persia wants to get it with as little deployment of its own, ultimately financial resources, as it can. That just seems, in practice, to be a basic rule of thumb. And maybe, in effect, it's a rule of thumb that has been already running since after 479, or certainly since after Eurymedon. I mean, drawing the boundary about when the steady state starts a bit depends on what you make of the Eurymedon campaign. Who was attacking whom then? That's the last moment at which there is a big, I mean, in terms of large congregations of Greek and Persian military resources facing each other in a single theatre of war. Why that happened, I mean, who was on the attack, does have a bearing on on the point at which you think the decision to abandon conquest or reconquest was actually made. But at the latest after that, and then shortly after that, Xerxes was murdered. There you do wonder whether, what's going on there. But we have no. We have stories about the murder of Xerxes, but we have no idea exactly why that happened. But I think the new king who emerged then, at the latest, it must be Artaxerxes I, who certainly embeds the notion that let's be a little reasonable about what we try to achieve here. He had trouble in Egypt, of course, and that will concentrate the mind. I mean, that took some time to suppress.
It limited
and
his
diverted resources. Sorry?
It limited his options in the.
Oh yes, indeed. But I mean, and that's in the time frames that are relevant. That kicked in on any reckoning of chronology pretty early in Artaxerxes' reign. Certainly before any point at which he might have been sort of thinking, well, should we have another go at conquering Asia Minor again and see? I mean, Egypt kicked in, and of course, well, that was another case in which these pesky Greeks from across the Aegean interfered in his affairs. But it looks to me, whether or not you believe in the Peace of Calais, and I'm still a skeptic on that, one way or the other, the conclusion was drawn that the best way to handle this situation was, in a sense, to do as little as possible. Was diplomacy, was to as Hyland would put it, was to rebadge what counted as the king's ideological purpose on the Western frontier, from the idea of reconquering Anatolia and reconquering and conquering Greece to making sure that the Greeks just beyond the frontier never forget that there is an extremely powerful state just to their east, which is perfectly capable of making itself a nuisance if it wants to, just to show. So Pissuthnes and Samos, for example, but isn't actually in the business of a full-scale war. I sometimes wonder whether the sense that an Athenian empire was emerging the other side of the wall, actually really helped here, because Artaxerxes could conjecture that, okay, the Athenians would interfere in Egypt, certainly, but he'd seen them off there. He would conjecture the Athenians were not in the business of trying to conquer Anatolia, that actually they were kind of fellow imperialists now, and maybe they could understand one another.
Right.
The Aegean is your world, and you can handle that. It's small, but then you're small, but it's manageable. This is my world, and let's kind of just agree to leave it at that. And maybe there was a Peace of Calais, an actual formal diplomatic instrument that enshrined this notion, and maybe there wasn't. Maybe just a sort of disengagement de facto, which as time went on became more and more as though there was a.
I was just going to say, in the worst case, the Persians still had the Spartan options, didn't they? And this is what then happened basically in the Peloponnesian War.
Oh yes. They from the moment the Great War started in 431, the king, even Thucydides tells us that the king was being pestered by Greeks who wanted him on their side, which was a victory from his point of view already. Yes. And a victory, and so his disinclination to bother to do anything about it is not necessarily isn't to be pictured as either lack of opportunity, as a lack of entrepreneurial flair, or weakness, or decadence, God forbid. It is he's enjoying the fact that he doesn't have to do anything for them both to think he's important, and it's always there if he chooses to. He can play this as he wants, and so I think he's probably quite enjoying that. It gets a bit tricky when then the old king dies again. When kings die, things, do. One of the remarkable things about the Achaemenid dynasty is that although whenever a king dies, it's tricky, the dynasty always holds. The next king is always a member of the family. That's quite striking. It doesn't work like that in a lot of parts of the ancient Near East.
No, it's most definitely one of the most durable dynasties, isn't it?
In those terms, very durable. Once Darius had established the new dynasty, then it stuck, despite the fact that every transition from one king to a next, has upset, shall we say, associated with it, and really quite considerable ones after Artaxerxes I died. That was a potential major system collapse, just 100 years on from Beistun, rather nicely, and yet the system survived that. There is something really remarkably durable, both about the dynasty and about, as it were, the infrastructure of empire. That it is, I suppose, impressive, really. But to go back to, to the Greek interface, the king is the king is winning as long as Greeks who are fighting one another would like to have him on their side. I mean, that's already acknowledged something in him. And eventually, when you get to the king's peace, and there is the king declaring what he considers it will be just to happen. I mean, this is a real ideological statement. The terminology in a few lines in Xenophon. This is the king not really, I mean, projecting himself not as engaged in a diplomatic enterprise with people and signing treaties and so on, though no things of that sort happen. What we actually have in the historical and the Greek historical source is the king's ideological proposition. Basically, I'm now the top guy. I will decide what is proper and right to happen. And those are the terms, it's what's dikaion. And I will, and if anyone doesn't go along with this, I will, take action to put them in their place. I mean, this is diktat, and is a tremendous, moral and political and ideological victory, as well as bringing back some territory. It's an extraordinary moment, and the only slight puzzle is you feel it could have happened quicker if they'd spent more money on it. But hey,
I will take action to bring them to their place. I think that was a great way to introduce us to the Persian side of things. Christopher, thank you very, very much for granting me this interview.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been surprising amount of fun, considering
you see
we are so far apart.
I'll convert you to become a fan of Zoom.
Well, for an enterprise of this sort, yes. For a one-to-one, or maybe I do, as it happens, have to. I have a Zoom meeting on Monday with colleagues in Israel.